Welcome to r/EntitledPeople, where we share stories from your lives about people who think the rules don't apply to them and they should get what they want. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. And today we have two great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story, entitled Landlords Trespass on the Property Without Warning to Control Our Every Single Step. The second story, I met with VP and we worked it out. The first story is, horrible landlords cost themselves a few thousand for being entitled a-holes. So this was almost 10 years ago. My dad got moved to another state for work the summer I graduated high school. My dad had to leave a few months early for his scheduled start date and to have time to look for a new house, while our family was packing the old one. Being unable to afford taking care of my 18-year-old self, I was forced to move with them, much to my disappointment. But my dad managed to pull some strings so that I could start my first job under him over the summer and get a jump start on enrolling at the local college. After a couple months of hotel living, paid for by Dad's company stipend, we found a great house that was relatively new, being rented by the original owners. They had just finished building their new house by the lake, and obviously didn't need their first house, so they thought renting it out would be a good investment. The cast is OP, me, mom and dad, my parents, assorted younger siblings. I'm the oldest of 5 with an age gap, and the landlords who we will call LL, landlord, and LW, landlord's wife. This house was everything we were looking for, exactly where we wanted it to be. Near the schools for my siblings, near my dad's work, and with a pool and a rec room for movie nights and video games. The area and time of year made my house hunting pretty tight at the time, so my dad basically jumped on it. LL got the lease typed up from a template, and my dad reviewed the whole thing before signing it. Now, my dad is a very meticulous person, and has always ingrained the idea of keeping an eye out for legal loopholes that could be used against you. Read every word of every contract you sign, and if something doesn't seem clear, ask. He isn't a lawyer by any means, and has made false legal assumptions himself, but he knows how to search law books if he needs to. This is important later. We move in and get all settled, but quickly start to learn that the landlords didn't really want to leave their old house. They just couldn't afford to keep both without extra income. They essentially viewed my family not as tenants but as groundskeepers that paid them for permission to maintain their house. LL for the most part wasn't actually that bad, but LW clearly wore the pants in the relationship, and LL was busy with his full-time job as the local postmaster. Also important later, so LW did most of the landlord-type things. It was very clear that she no longer had anything else to do now, since she had been a stay-at-home mom, and their youngest daughter had started school. I will say that I did not like this woman from the start because of a comment she made when we toured the house. In a very thick southern accent, it was something along the lines of not needing to worry about her younger daughter, who was adopted, growing tall enough for sports because she's Asian. This woman was a cartoonish stereotype who gave off narcissistic white savior vibes. The orphanage lady from Despicable Me crossed with Paula Deen comes to mind. She also definitely did not like my mom and siblings when she first met them, which I realize now screams racism, as she'd only met my dad and I, who were white as white bread. But my mom is Hispanic, so her and some of my siblings are more on the toasted whole wheat side. She acted like it was a privilege that she was letting us live in her house. This lady would nitpick everything that wasn't perfect about the house, and loved showing up unannounced. We would get notes on the door about needing to water the floors more, or that the grass is supposed to be mowed every Saturday, or don't cut the invasive vines she planted and were growing up the backside of the house. I got up early to mow the lawn the next Saturday after the note to get her off our backs, and halfway through a truck showed up with a paid lawn crew. Obviously, she hadn't said a word about this to my parents. She would come to the door when my parents were gone and say she left something in the garage, which they had, like paint and insulation and other remodeling supplies, but then went upstairs because she was checking on something she talked to my dad about. My dad, of course, had not spoken to her at all, and this was obviously an issue for my parents. At one point, she tried to get my 5-year-old brother to let her in right after he got off the bus. This was at a time of day when both my parents were usually working, and I had just gotten out of class, but our middle siblings would have been home already. So he wasn't by himself, just no adults yet. To her surprise though, my dad had stayed home that day and parked inside the garage for once. He was peeved. He immediately told her she needed to leave and typed up an email to LL, stating that if they tried to enter the property again, he would be going to court about it. This included not being permitted to enter the backyard, which she obviously had on numerous occasions, as the lease stated they had to give 48 hours notice if they needed to enter the property for any reason. They did not take this well and things just kept escalating. LW would schedule maintenance on days we had planned for parties or family events, and we still have no idea how she knew when they would be. She even had a tree removal service show up on brother's birthday to remove all the trees along the back fence, supposedly for safety reasons, but that was an obviously lie. It did, however, prevent us from using the pool at our pool party. LW would also claim all sorts of things weren't allowed on account of HOA violations that my parents knew were false, because the HOA president was also my little brother's Sunday school teacher, and they had brought up the issues with her. The HOA president told us that LW was a nightmare when they had lived in the neighborhood, and still showed up to the monthly meetings, because she was still technically an owner, and was using the meetings as an excuse to check up on us every chance she got, even asking the neighbors about us. The HOA was actually very lax in its regulations, and mostly dealt with just the shared spaces and garbage removal, but LW was generally disliked for trying to turn it into one of the stories over on /JustKnowHOA. My parents, of course, started looking for a place to move near the end of the lease, and managed to secure a place 3 months before the end, but didn't say anything to LL and LW. Well, come 30 days to the day before the end of the lease, LW shows up at the door for no apparent reason. As I was the only adult home, 19 by this point, I answered the door, and just as I opened the door to hear her excuse, the mail truck pulled up behind her. She starts walking away as if she changed her mind, because she thought my dad was home to talk to her, and I step out to grab the mail since it's here. The postman gets out of his truck and says he has some certified mail that needs to be signed for by an adult, and LW pipes up. Pointing at me, he's an adult, he can take it. It was an eviction notice indicating that our landlords, standing 3 feet from me, had decided we were not keeping up to the standards of our lease, and would not be renewing it. As such, we would be out within 30 days. Well, knowing that we were already moving, I just accepted it and went back inside. It was very clear that LW was there specifically to make sure we got the notice, which was only valid from the day it was officially received. She, of course, also knew exactly when it would get there, and likely timed it as such. Again, so that my parents weren't home, because LL was the postmaster. I called my dad right away and he was fuming. Luckily, we had actually already gotten the keys for the new house, as the previous tenants were out the week before, so we were totally moved within 2 weeks, and my dad and I spent the last 2 weeks going over every inch of the house to make sure there wasn't a chip of paint or carpet stain in sight. We even went as far as repainting a couple rooms using the leftover paint in the garage. Out of spite, my dad decided not to pay the last month's rent. LW should have waited a day, because we had paid first and last month's rent and security deposit when we moved in. Well, a month later, LL and LW had been harassing my parents about the last month's rent, and then claimed that we owed further beyond the security deposit because of all the repairs they had to make after we left. We knew that was total BS because we had honestly left the place better than we got it. So one day we went by, we still lived pretty close, and peeked in the windows to find that they were doing a full remodel, and probably trying to get us to pay for it. This set a fire under my dad they would regret. In that state, landlords are required to set up a specific bank account for security deposits that both the landlord and renter have access to, that's not to be touched during the term of the lease. My dad a couple months earlier had asked LL for the account info, having just recently discovered that the rule while looking into ways to fend off their constant harassment. Dad had only asked a couple times, and kinda let it slide because he was pretty high up the regional totem pole at work, and was always busy, including a lot of traveling. Now, however, he was on a mission and started demanding the security deposit be returned. In one particular phone call with LL that was getting very heated, Dad started spouting off the specific legal references that he was reading right off the state's website, and he very clearly heard LW from the background say to LL, "Is that the money that's in the safe?" Checkmate. My dad immediately chimed in on not only that they had failed to meet state requirements, but also that if I recall correctly, the minimum penalty, as stated on the state's website in front of him, was forfeiture of the security deposit, but also any other dues and fees paid before move-in. So not only were we not behind on rent and owing cost of repairs, but they actually owed us the deposit and 2 months' rent. My dad immediately pointed out to LL and LW and added just to rub in that they couldn't get out of it because all their conversations for the last few months had been recorded, either through email or the recording app on his phone. So yes, they had to pay us back every single penny. The second story is, wanted to share my little victory. I found myself across the virtual table from HR and my department's director. I knew what was happening. I started desktop recording because they weren't going to use the meeting recording feature. I had my script read of what I was going to say, and told myself no matter what, do not deviate from it. Lights, camera, action. Hold on, time out. Remember how I said I knew what was happening? It is because I knew exactly what was going to be said and by whom. Cue heist movie music. 2 weeks before this meeting, the department director goes on a call with me and plainly stated that I had to be back in the office for 4 days. A week, no exceptions. They invited HR mid-meeting to basically repeat what the director had said. I said that I couldn't possibly do that, and the HR rep looked me into my soul and said, "That's not the company's problem. We're being more than understanding and generous." I even offered to take reduced pay to stay remote. They literally word for word just repeated what they said earlier. I felt powerless. I mean, who do you go to when HR is at your throat, too? This completely blindsided me, as approximately a month before this, that same director had verbally affirmed that I do not need to come back to the office and that we could start the conversation again a year from that date. Me, still trusting my elders if you catch my drift, thought nothing of it. I didn't even ask for written confirmation of what the director had told me. I know. It gets worse though. In this same meeting, the one 2 weeks before the big one, I tell the director in HR, "Hey, you said I didn't have to worry and we would talk about it next year. I made big decisions under this affirmation." To which the director replied coldly, "I never said that." They straight up lied to my face. Their words like daggers, their expression like bad porn acting. I knew in that moment that these two people were my mortal enemies, and that I would not only win, but utterly decimate their existence. What they didn't know is that they had given me the tool of my salvation, the process flow. I had until the big meeting, from the beginning, which was 2 weeks to get back into the office or present a plan of coming back. This plan would be reviewed by them, director and HR rep, and then sent to the department VP for approval. If I refused to come back, they would voluntarily resign me from my position. I didn't know what I know now, so I felt as though I'm effed anyway. I might as well go down gloriously. So I did what any sane person would do. I called the VP and told them everything. The VP was upset that their director would not own up to their word, and they said not to worry about it as my team is remote capable. I didn't mention the big meeting coming up, because I wanted, nay, I needed to see their faces as I obliterated them. I can only say that many beers were drank that night coming up with my script of what to say to my two mortal enemies, who had no idea of my shenanigans. Lights, camera, action. HR rep asks me for my plan to return to work while director nods their head menacingly, tight lips and all. I say one sentence and that's it. I met with VP and we worked it out. They both looked completely shocked, mouths agape and their eyes darting around trying to regain control over me. They asked what my return to work plan is, and I said the same thing again with a big old smile on my face. They tried to say how I was refusing to return to work, and that they would begin the resignation process. I said, you guessed it, the same thing again. By now I could tell they were both dumbfounded and furious. I just kept looking and smiling. They ended the meeting saying they would bring my refusal to the VP, because honestly I think they didn't know what to do. This time I said, just kidding, the exact same thing again. They tried to start recording the meeting, and at this point I typed in the chat, "Have another meeting, have to run. Thank you." I definitely didn't have another meeting. I left and never heard anything about again. Then a couple weeks later, I found out that both director and HR rep were let go. Turns out there's a head of HR, and I let them know how their rep talked to me. Victory is mine. The end. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Don't forget to subscribe and have a nice day.